Sasha and her mum, Valentina, had recently moved to a new place from a faraway country, and everything was so different: the food, the language, and even the way people dressed. Valentina always encouraged Sasha to be brave and kind, even when things felt strange or hard. One sunny afternoon, as Sasha and Valentina were planting flowers in their garden, they heard a voice from the other side of the fence. It was their neighbor, Mrs. Smith. She often looked grumpy and never smiled at them. In fact, she seemed a bit mean sometimes. Sasha always kept quiet when she saw her, but couldn't understand why her mum always tried to talk to Mrs. Smith, even when she wasn't very friendly. "Mum," Sasha asked, "why do you always talk to Mrs. Smith? She doesn't seem to like us." Valentina smiled gently at Sasha. "Well, sweetheart, Mrs. Smith doesn't know us very well. We come from a different country, and we don't speak her language perfectly. Sometimes people can be a little afraid or unsure of things they don't understand." "But why?" Sasha wondered, frowning. Valentina thought momentarily, then said, "Imagine if you met someone who looked and sounded very different. You might feel a little scared or unsure at first, right?" Sasha nodded. "I guess so." "Well," Valentina continued, "it's hard to hate someone for being different when you're too busy laughing together. That's why I keep talking to Mrs. Smith. I want her to see that we're not so different after all." Just then, a funny thing happened. As Valentina spoke, a little squirrel dashed across the yard, tripped over its own tail, and tumbled right into Mrs. Smith's garden. Sasha and Valentina burst out laughing, and to their surprise, so did Mrs. Smith. Her laugh was loud and hearty, and it echoed through the neighborhood. Mrs. Smith walked over to the fence, still chuckling. "Did you see that silly squirrel?" she asked, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. "Yes," Sasha giggled. "It was so funny." Valentina smiled warmly at Mrs. Smith. "Sometimes laughter is the best way to understand each other," she said. Mrs. Smith nodded, still smiling. "You're right, Valentina. I think I've been a bit silly myself. I'm sorry if I seemed unfriendly. I'd like to get to know you better." From that day on, Mrs. Smith often joined Valentina and Sasha in their garden. They shared stories and laughed together, and slowly but surely, Mrs. Smith began to understand that difference wasn't bad. It was just different. And so, with a little bit of patience and laughter, a new friendship blossomed. Sasha learned that sometimes all it takes to turn